The truth is, just a few months before the Rugby World Cup, Itzebit was on trial for racial slurs and such. We need to really evaluate what does unity mean and truly what do we view as unity in today's debate to truly win. So a few points of strategic context, right? So firstly, let's look at what the questions in today's debate are. One, what do we define as unity? Secondly, was this actually unifying? Thirdly, did it have a negative net effect? Fourthly, when do we regret a narrative or a portrayal specifically? What is the role of sports in nation building? But thirdly, lastly, what do we need to change in South Africa? Which South Africa is the best version of South Africa? So let's look at the three burdens we're going to prove to you in today's debate and ultimately what's going to determine why we win. One, we're going to prove why this is not true, but even if why it's true, the emphasis and the portrayal of it is still regrettable. But secondly, how it meets the criteria of regretting a narrative. But thirdly, why it has a net harm, essentially, right? Let's look at a few points of context when we get into this, right? One, the context, we have 3 points of context. So one, what is the role of sports in nation building of South Africa? One, so understand, we have South Africa has developed the trend of being very patriotic in terms of these national sports, but also the significance of it is South Africa wants to use this maybe to span the gaps in things like race and things like that. So mechanisms that they use to try this are things twofold, like things like the notion of the rainbow nation. Secondly, things of sports. So 1996 Rugby World Cup, the 2010 World Cup, right? So note here that these have been using for a really long time. So they have been using this for a really long time. Note here that even people have started denouncing the idea of rainbow nation and proving its illegitimacy, right? One, so illegitimacy. So secondly, let's look at the criteria of when we regret a narrative, and this is 3 things. One, when it's regressive for the nation specifically, because we're talking about the nation's unity. But secondly, when it serves harmful to the nation and its initial goal of the movement or the country. But thirdly, when it sends out a false interpretation of view, a notion of this, right? So let's look at lastly, what do we define as unity? And this is perhaps the most important question in today's debate. What do we define as unity? So 4 things under here. One, what we define as unity is ultimate social cohesion, especially in South Africa with the different races and stuff. But more importantly, it's not only showing a united front, but within that front, having united different individualities. So we're happy that we won the overall World Cup, but we're also happy that the other person is happy that we won. This is quite important to characterize because unity is also in the interactions between the people in the nation. But secondly, how sometimes when we value social cohesion between the government of the country, but also with the people of the country, so this unity extends to such structures in order to be holistically important. But thirdly, how it has no long-term regression of the nation. But fourthly and lastly, when it does so for a reasonable or meaningful amount of time, and it serves a reasonable amount of purpose. So let's look at the first thing I'll be dealing with. Why we miss the criteria of regretting a notion. So firstly, why this isn't true. So we have 4 things under here. So why isn't true? And we needed to refer back to the context of what national unity actually is. Not taken, right? What national unity is. For example, we told you, we give you an example that national unity isn't just a national, a united front against its individual interactions between it. For example, an ANC example. The ANC would be happy that we won the elections, but it doesn't actually have unity if Ace Magashula literally doesn't want Ramaphosa to be the head of this, literally doesn't care for the other people within the ANC movement. This is a relevant example to show that unity doesn't only exist in a united front overall, but also with the interactions between the people in there. So let's look at why it's not true. It barely reached most of South Africa. So 2 things under here. One, let's understand that after they won the World Cup, we had a national rugby tour. But this rugby tour was particularly problematic in terms of who it reached. It only reached the major cities in South Africa. People of Northern Cape, people of Free State expressed open concerns or open regret of the fact that they weren't included within the victory. But secondly, I'll take you after my point. But secondly, how things like the rural black people didn't actually, one, watch the match, but secondly, didn't care enough to watch the match. This is to show you that it barely reached most of the people we actually care about and most of the interactions we actually care to make very relevant, right? So yeah, take it.
Do you think that the portrayal of the Soccer World Cup being a unifying force was harmful to South Africa?
Right. So I'll prove to you why that was still harmful given the context of South Africa. So unity doesn't only exist in solving race issues. We have a lot of issues that contribute to why South Africa is quite messed up. Things like poverty that aren't addressed by such things. Things like gender-based violence, and we'll show you in a second speech why particularly problematic of these sports are quite how they're misogynistic but also quite immoral in the portrayal. So let's look at secondly how it didn't last for a meaningful amount of time. So this is to say that people who support the rugby support it in bursts of excitement, so in bursts of spontaneity, right? So people only supported the rugby when we had the Rugby World Cup, but furthermore, a few months after the Rugby World Cup, people don't care enough about that victory, don't care enough about that unity supposedly achieved. But thirdly, why it's not true in the interactions of people. So thirdly, like 3 things under here. So first, it encourages tribalism. Understand that Siya Kolisi is a Xhosa. What people actually felt about such was to say that the reason why it's quite important that this person is the first black president is because he's a Xhosa. It fuels the continuous domination of cultures like Zulu cultures and Xhosa cultures. The fact that people who are Tsonga probably don't relate to the fact that he's the first black president because of the emphasis of the fact that he's Xhosa and from the Eastern Cape. This is quite important, not taken. But secondly, it's very exclusionary to some black South Africans who just don't feel like this is good enough to actually create unity. The fact that you think that the idea of the World Cup being unity is a sham means that you're legitimized from the entire movement of being involved in it. So you're not involved in the idea of unity and how you denounce for thinking that it's not a true idea. But thirdly, South Africa's context and South Africa's problems that we need to solve. And I hinted to this, the fact that when we get ultimate unity in South Africa, is not just going to target one issue such as race and how we get some integration, and I'll prove why that doesn't happen. Either way, we have a lot of other issues that will hinder this unity from ultimately existing. Things like poverty and not being able to access such systems, things like racially based violence and things such as that, right? But lastly, how this is quite very superficial, right? So let's look at secondly why, even if it was true, why there's a net negative effect on these people. So 3 things under here. 1, it legitimizes the system, the really illegitimate systems in rugby unions. The fact that we don't have enough black people in the union when we have Siya Kolisi as the first, emphasizing that he's the first black captain, it means that it lessens the incentive to have more black people within those spaces because we validated the fact that they're transitioning, we validated the fact that there is some sort of unity that happens, right? The perception of change is influenced, therefore we don't actually fix such problematic systems. So secondly, it fuels the negativity around nation building. So people who don't actually believe it, this is fueled. Like the fact that we spent so much money, so much fame on this, when in the end it didn't actually achieve anything, fuels the negative views around overall nation building. But lastly, how it supports the narrative that the only sports that will ever ultimately succeed in the international spheres are white-dominated sports. Things like swimming, things like rugby, things like cricket. Ultimately, it supports that narrative, even when it's not true, even when that's not the case. It is the perception that is reached. You stand with side proposition.
I think that tensions in South Africa were rising at an astronomical rate. We think that racial tensions, but more likely suppression of the black body and false narratives that having black people in spaces is something which ultimately harms them. We find it problematic then for Prop to assert that by having a narrative which directly contradicts this, when showing that Owen is both unifying, but unifying because of the presence of those minorities is something that they regret. We think it's obvious that side op is going to take this debate. Before we move on, we need to recognize what the op burdens are in this debate. At no point do we have to prove to you that complete unity is achieved in this debate. We find it bizarre for Prop to try and tell us that just because unity is not achieved, that they regret the narratives. All we have to prove is that it's a unifying force which actively gives a contribution to moving us towards a more unified state. It means that what they then have to prove as a proposition is proving that not only does it not just proving that total unity isn't achieved, but that it doesn't achieve any form of unifying force and that it actively harms that. So in saying that, what are we going to be proving? Firstly, that the narrative in itself is legitimate. Secondly, we're going to be proving that it actively helps people within South Africa, specifically vulnerable groups. Thirdly, within Boyf's speech, we'll be talking about perceptions around sport and rugby in general and how that actively helps perceptions around South Africa internationally. Before we move on, let's do a few pieces of rebuttal. Firstly, one question we get from Zinhle's speech is it legitimate? And what does she tell us here? She tells us that the unity in itself is short-lasting. She tells us that it's superficial, and due to that, we can't buy into that also because it's not true. First point of rebuttal is that we don't think that is necessarily not true. We think that people that showing that a team being diverse and achieving a certain feat is still something we think people can buy into and be unified within it. We think that most South Africans themselves, due to some form of nationalist sentiment, were still in a sort of morale boost within that country, and we think that portraying it as such is something which is legitimate. We don't get analysis to actually prove it's not true. Secondly, she tells us that because it doesn't reach everyone, it's something which you can't regret. We don't think that this is necessarily relevant. Why? Because if you don't reach some people in poverty, we don't necessarily think that it's not necessarily unifying. We think that if you can still bring certain aspects of the nation together, but not necessarily all of them, you still are actively contributing towards a form of unity. But we even reject the premise that most people in certain areas don't buy into it, because we do think that certain people, such as people from Siya Kolisi's home township, were people who bought into this idea of unity. We think that those individuals from impoverished circumstances who you claim don't care, but still contribute and still buy into that. Then what we also get from them is because it's short-lasting. We think that this in itself doesn't necessarily have to be true, but most of the actual mechanisms disproving this will be directly clashed within second point of substantive. So secondly, we also get this idea of does it help? So firstly, can we deal with this weird point of tribalism? Like, what actually was that? We think that them trying to say that just because simply because people are proud of Xhosa heritage within Siya Kolisi, that feeds into tribalism isn't true. Because one, most of it is in jest anyway, but secondly, most of his emphasis is on him being from a black captain and a black township and achieving that feat. We don't think people saying that because Xhosa people are proud of that is something which is divisive, weird. Secondly, we also think that what they tell us is that it also moves towards regression and that it doesn't help a country move forward. We think that just because you can be unified within it and using a narrative and portraying it as something which is unifying doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's suddenly going to negate certain problems. Like, people are still able to recognize systems of disadvantage, but they can still feel a sense of pride and still feel a sense of unity with other people. So this looks like someone being able to say that there are structural disadvantages, but at the end of the day, we are all South African, and that World Cup reminding you that you are South African. We think, I'll take you in a sec, that nationalist rhetoric can still work. So what do we think? We still think that their mechanism hasn't been proven, but moreover, that it's not legitimate. So, yes.
Lonze, would you support the portrayal of the Banyana making it to the final as like a unifying front for men and women in South Africa?
What we think then is, one, that's a different thing to what we have in the Rugby World Cup, but we still think we can support it as being unifying, as supporting a team which is comprised mainly of women making it to that final. But moreover, we think it's specifically unifying because of the diversity of South African. We think that Banyana is still mainly black dominated, but what we want is a diverse group of people and showing that people can buy into that. We don't think that point is relevant. So what do we have in substantive? Firstly, that is principally legitimate, but secondly, that we pragmatically help people with this portrayal. So what we need to understand here is who is actually pushing this narrative, because we get no analysis from proposition. We see this being mainly pushed by media outlets. We see this being used in a form of media, saying that people themselves actively contribute to that unity. That becomes important when looking at the direct obligations of those media outlets and why we specifically consider that portrayal to be legitimate. Firstly, in terms of why we think that media portrayal of minorities is important. Looking at the nature of how this unity is portrayed, they're mainly focusing on saying that the presence of disadvantaged groups directly contributes to that unity, and because they are present and actively contributing, they say that winning is something which is which is hinged upon everyone in the country being present. They're saying that that win is something which everyone has achieved and stating that all members of the country have some form of stake in it. Why do we think that this is something which is valuable? Because we think that the current perception of those minorities from media is actively adverse. We think that most people themselves are portrayed as actively stemming South African growth, and when poverty is stressed in most media outlets, most of it are from those disadvantaged minority groups. I think any narrative which can give that form of empowerment to those groups by telling them they are actively part of contributing to the win and upliftment of the country in that rugby is something you support. But the second level here is that other World Cups have also had unifying narratives, and we think that not giving one to this one actively undermines the success of this World Cup. Why do we say this? Because we think that at the point you're willing to acknowledge other World Cups as being important as part of South African history, we think the only way of which to get importance within this one is to stress it as being portrayed as a unifying experience. Thirdly, we also have to acknowledge that progression in itself has happened, and acknowledging that progression has happened by showing that unity has occurred within those World Cups is important. So what do we think? We think it's still principally legitimate. And practically speaking, we think that we support unifying forces when firstly it uplifts that population, secondly it actively changes harmful narratives. This looks like things around quota systems, and this looks like racial tensions around black people in a workforce. We think that by telling people that you are meant to be unified under that one banner, and that black leadership in itself can lead to success and can lead to accurate nation building, you're more likely to get inclusion within that country. You're more likely to actually get people buying in. If they're willing to concede upon how South Africans prioritize and value sport, we think people in those areas who value that sport are likely then to be more open to those ideas. But secondly, we think that you're also likely to ease those racial tensions because unity is being stressed as the main part of national rhetoric. Because we think that we haven't actually got analysis from prop and that we've proven that it's legitimate, we think you should side with side opposition.
It's awfully ironic we were given this debate motion, because I was at a debate training when I watched the rugby team win the World Cup. And when our team stood to sing the national anthem, when the stem came on, most of the black speakers sat down because they felt that wasn't their anthem, because they didn't want to speak Afrikaans, and because despite the fact that we won this for the black youth, for the people who support the EFF, for the people who bear the brunt of the fact that their country has failed them, this is affront and this is false. And this is not something to be proud of, a country that doesn't represent them and an anthem that doesn't represent them. With that, first of all, let's do a strategic clear-up, because we think they've shirked a lot of what they have to prove to us in today's debate. Essentially, Luandle said, we have to prove that there was something positive that came out of this narrative. No. First of all, one, you had to prove that the type of unity was valuable. A lot of this unity might have been between white English people and Afrikaans English people. That's fairly inconsequential. Two, you had to prove that the narrative in and of itself is true. This is important because you burdened yourself with legitimacy. Surely it is wrong to lie to the public. Three, even if the narrative is not true, you not only needed to prove that there were positive effects as a result of this unity, you had to prove that there were net positive effects, that the entirety, if we add it all together, resulted in some type of positivity. And four, you needed to engage with our characterization of what unity is, because we can conclude that Luandle's entire speech proved that individual people were happy about the win of the World Cup. Unity means that you are unified with someone else who is different to you. Even the black children in our Gauteng delegation who were happy about the win did not feel unified with Afrikaans, and that as a nation. You didn't change the individual interactions. We gave you analysis of the ANC, that every ANC member is going to be happy when the ANC wins the election, but Ace Magashule thinks that Cyril Ramaphosa is a criminal because of Americana and literally wouldn't be upset if he died today. That's not unity, that's wanting something for yourself, not changing your interaction with other people. With that, 2 points of rebuttal before I get into my point about how the emphasis in and of itself is fundamentally immoral. No, thank you, Boyps. So, first of all, whether or not it's true, and they didn't really give us much analysis here, they just gave us this idea that people felt very happy when the World Cup happened. Most of it happened in their rebuttal. So first of all, they said there's nothing wrong with people feeling proud of their culture and Siya Kolisi and the Eastern Cape celebrating a Xhosa win. So, first of all, this negates the fact that tribalism is a major problem in South Africa. This negates the fact that Tswana mothers do not want their daughters dating Zulu men because they see them as dominant, because they see them as someone they don't want to interact with. Why is this specifically harmful with the Xhosa narrative? Because a lot of people see Xhosa people as too proud, as boasting too much. The fact that Miss South Africa has just become Xhosa, the fact that our first black president was Xhosa, they're saying, listen, this is Xhosa excellence, not black excellence. That also means that it doesn't reach the parts of South Africa that need this unity the most. A lot of rural areas in the Eastern Cape cared about rugby already. That's where all of our black players come from already. What we needed was for Zulu people to care about this. What we needed was for Tsonga people to care about this. And this perpetuates a harmful stereotype about Xhosa people. 2, they said that the rural-urban divide wasn't important. Actually, it was essential, because we think that the black people who are partaking in rugby are private school black people. Siya Kolisi went to a private school. The fact of the matter is, it's important for unity because the people South Africa needs to unify with in the first place are poor people, are people living in rural areas. What did we tell you? No response. 1, these people didn't watch the World Cup in the first place. They didn't care at all. 2, the people who did watch the World Cup, the people who really cared about this, weren't visited in the tour and now feel active resentment to the South African rugby structures, the people in the Eastern Cape who were cheering for Siya Kolisi from his home time. 3, they said that that's a good narrative because there's a mixed race team. This is a lie. We've already shown you that Etzebeth, one of the players on this team, was on trial for hate speech only a few months against black people, only a few months before they participated in the Rugby World Cup. To put that in perspective, not even Vicky Momberg's form of racism classified as hate speech. This is extreme racism, okay? We think extreme racism. So it's fundamentally untrue. Next, they didn't engage with the fact that the net effect in and of itself was wrong. 1, when you realize that you're in the same situation as you were when we won the first Rugby World Cup, when we won the second Rugby World Cup, and we won the third one, it's going to fuel the rhetoric that we're funding all of this money, all of this time, all of this energy into something that isn't uplifting rural South Africa, that fuels rhetoric that racial unity is never going to work, that Rainbow Nation or any sort of like that, something like that, is never going to work. 2, we've idolized Rassie Erasmus, which means that we don't change the harmful quota system that only allows black people from private schools to get into these teams, that doesn't change the access for this stuff, that uses black people for the win. When Siya Kolisi was accepted to his private school, he couldn't speak a word of English, and the only person who taught it to him was his Xhosa friend, his black friend in that school. The rugby structures didn't care because he was just there to give them the win. This was a harmful thing. This is a system that we entrench because we idolize people like Rassie Erasmus for doing this thing. And finally, it entrenches the narrative that the only sports that South Africa is ever going to be effective in, the only sports we're ever going to win in, are white sports, are swimming with Chad Leclos, are rugby, an Afrikaans sport, not something like soccer that a majority of South Africans care about, support, and love. Before I move on to my substantive matter about how the emphasis is wrong, I'll take Luandle.
Okay, Ella, can you actually debate in reality? Because what this portrayal looks like is saying that by virtue of these people coming from disadvantaged circumstances and contributing to that win, that in itself is unifying, not just because we took people from private schools.
So first of all, I've already shown you how Siya Kolisi came from a disadvantaged background and they used him, and he's lucky that someone else who came from a disadvantaged background and spoke Xhosa and English was able to help him in the first place. 2, they don't come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Most black people who play in these teams come from private schools. We're not helping uplift rural communities. We're not helping any other province except the Eastern Cape. So why is the emphasis in and of itself fundamentally wrong? This means that in my point, I'm going to prove that even if it is true that it created some sort of unity, even if it created some type of positive effect, the way in which it was emphasized is something that is truly immoral, and the extent that it was emphasized is truly immoral. Why? because it was deeply, deeply sexist and misogynistic, and that's something that we have to address in sports in South Africa. Female sports in South Africa often have no government funding, if so, they're very, very small, and barely any fan base. An example of this is that our netball team in August, right before we won the Rugby World Cup, won the Netball World Cup. And most people don't even know about it. They had to go there on their own dime, their own dollar, and their own sponsorship, and people still don't care about this kind of stuff. Banyana is consistently winning all of their games, and Bafana cannot even break into the World Cup bracket, but we militantly support them, we appreciate them, and we do this kind of stuff. The fact that two teams, one full of women and one full of men, could win a World Cup in the exact same year, only a few weeks apart, and that a lot of people wouldn't even know about it, shows that the extent of the emphasis that the government and the people have chosen to put on this is fundamentally immoral, because it's truly sexist. It's sexist to say that these people got there on their own dime, they didn't get there with massive amounts of government funding like the Boks, and they don't deserve our support. It's sexist that the government didn't acknowledge them on social media or go on a victory tour with them like they should have. It's sexist because this team was actually a majority black team, and we didn't acknowledge the racial unity there. Because the emphasis and the extent of it in and of itself is immoral, we cannot support this.
Panel, it's unfortunate that Ella's privilege has seeped through all of the matter and proposition, because we think a lot of what they are saying are blatant lies. I didn't come into this debate to be a fact checker, but obviously I have to be charitable to the proposition, so we'll do that. So understanding that, what as an opposition am I going to do in my speech? Two things that I'll be proving. That first of all, we bettered international perception through the portrayal, but secondly, we actually fixed the rugby structures that they just claim never get better through the portrayal. But before that, 3 points of rebuttal. So firstly, let's understand how they lie about what the portrayal actually is, and they never once engage with the role of media in South Africa. We think they do three key things that they miss on this side of the house. First of all, they tell us that in South Africa, the major problem they had towards the end of Ella's speech was that we portrayed the Rugby World Cup as something that was being good and not everything else. So note how this analysis doesn't disprove that that portrayal was something that was inherently harmful. They say because not everything was on the same level, it was illegitimate. We had two responses to this. First of all, they had to interact with the scope of rugby. They concede to the idea that in 1995, the unifying force that would help South Africa was winning rugby. So historically, we have major ties to rugby that we don't have to other sports. This means stuff like rugby, stuff like netball, they can't claim a sport that we should always prioritize as a country. We are allowed to prioritize what is likely to lead to better outcomes. Second of all, to say it was something that is when she claims like something like netball and Banyana we don't glorify because we win there but we don't glorify them, is a blatant lie. Banyana is not one of the best teams in the world, but even in those instances, we would like a portrayal that highlights how we don't do enough for them and fixing that. On their side of the house, they would say, no portrayal for anyone is better because we don't do it for them specifically. On a comparative, they do nothing for Banyana. But thirdly, and most importantly, they can't speak about structures like netball and exclude and then don't understand this debate was about unifying. Oftentimes, the reason we don't prioritize sports like swimming, sports like swimming or netball, is because it is still white dominated, where quotas haven't been able to seep into this type of structure. The reason we prioritize things like rugby is because the portrayal of the way quotas have filtered through is an important part of the way in which that thing works. Fourth response here is to understand what the portrayal of this actually meant for the sport, because they say the portrayal meant that only privileged black people get into these sports. So panel, let's give a quick lesson on how quotas actually work within rugby, because we don't think they understand what these structures look like. Oftentimes you have quotas for a specific number of players who come from a quintile 5 school, and then you have players who come from quintile 1 schools. The thing that's problematic here is they say Siya Kolisi was underprivileged, but he got into a private school. They never describe how he got to that point. He got there because the talent of his rugby and quotas allowed him to enter a space like that. The portrayal of Siya Kolisi getting into the Rugby World Cup team and being the captain is to show that quotas can work in levels where you are so unempowered that you can get into a private school and make it to the top. That is the importance of those quotas. But secondly, they claim that progression never happens, and this is the second point of rebuttal. So panel, on the opposition case, do we actually have progression in any of the World Cups through the portrayals of winning? Two responses here. First of all, it is a blatant lie that they say we haven't progressed from the 1995 World Cup to where we are. If that was the case, we wouldn't have a black rugby captain. Second of all, the problem here is that they never speak about how the different teams have looked across the years. From 1995, we had a white captain with one person of color being Chester Williams. By the second World Cup, we praised a captain in John Smith and a winger in Brian Habana. By the third World Cup, we were speaking about a 60% black team with a black captain that is taking ourselves to win the World Cup. That is what progression looks like in the real world. We're the only side we can show is that the portrayal is necessary to change these people, but not asserting things. Why do we think the opposition is actually taking it? Three things. First of all, we've shown how portrayal has led to progression on a wider scale from 1995 until now. Second of all, we've shown you how the other specters they speak about are not getting portrayed, not because we are sexist, but because we are allowed to prioritize what is likely to unify us best, but on a comparative, we do more for black people. So 2 points of substantive that I'm going to bring in my speech. First of all, why are we better for rugby in structures, and why are we better for the international sphere? There are 3 levels to understand about rugby being exclusionary. So first of all, to understand rugby as a structure is to say that it has been predominantly white dominated during pre-apartheid times. It means that the way we view quotas currently in sports in general, or even affirmative action, is that we often see black people in spaces entering feeling like they shouldn't be there, or they feel like they aren't good enough. Thirdly, they also lack the idea of good role models being prioritized in the media's eyes. So the media never pushes black CEOs as being something that is particularly good, because people like Ella would have you say that because Cyril Ramaphosa got in through BEE, not the poor black people are disadvantaged because they can't get to the same point where he is. The thing that they lack here is 3 key things. First of all, the reason we are better for rugby is because we changed the narrative around quotas. A portrayal means a prioritization of black people being at the centerfold of the way rugby has been. Note this is unique to this World Cup that is different to all the others. Secondly, the thing that they miss here about quotas is they often play on the mindsets of people. It is the first time in a World Cup we have seen, I'll take you soon, a quota player, quote unquote, like Mampimpi, who's actually performing and scoring a try in the World Cup. What you do here is you start to create narratives that black people are able to fill quota positions and that they can be recognized and actually be good in the team. The portrayal of this means that we are better off in pushing it to the most amount of people. So even if we don't reach every single person in rural Eastern Cape, we are reaching more people than they ever would if they regretted the portrayal in its entirety and never wanted it to happen. But secondly, let's understand how we actually change structures. But I'll prove that to you after this POI.
We've had Rainbow Nation BEE. At this point, black people are at a tipping point where they realize none of these systems will ever trickle down to them. That causes a tear in that unity.
Okay, so first of all, we can concede that not every single unifying factor has one that has led to us to be a perfect South Africa. Our comparative in this debate was proving that we are better where we were from 1994 to 2019. Panel, if they want to argue we've never gotten better, they will lose. That is factually incorrect. So understanding structures, let's understand how you alter unions and the way you incentivize people to get black players into more teams. So first of all, perceptions around unions often centers around them feeling that that a certain method is going to work. So in sports, it's seeing that something that's been tried and proven is something that they are willing to take on because they understand that the risks are something that are lessened. Why do we think the portrayal helps in doing this? First of all, you start to change the perceptions around rugby coaches that black players are only 1 in a million and they are something that are rare. The problem with their case is that they concede that maybe Siya Kolisi at his time was an exception. He was a one player who couldn't speak English and got into a team. The reality is now, even if we have more black individuals from private schools who are getting into rugby teams, those are black individuals they regret for getting in purely because they were more privileged than the black person next to them. The problem with this is that you start to undermine quota systems as a whole, which doesn't allow poorer individuals to ever get in. The problem here is what we say on our side, the reason we are better for structures is 2 things. First of all, we challenge white domination as a concept ever happening because we don't care that Peter Steph du Toit is the best player in the world. We care that the most impactful player in the world was Siya Kolisi. Second thing to understand then, how that plays into international narratives and international perceptions. South Africa historically has had a very very interesting connection with the way that sports has been dealt with. Sanctions were placed on our sports teams to prohibit us from interacting with the rest of the world. Us being able to win the World Cup shows that we progressed from a point at when sanctions weren't even allowed because we were so racially exclusive that they didn't want to interact with us. Now we have a black captain shaking the hand with the Prince of England. The important thing to take away from this point is two things. First of all, you allow them to legitimize a government who has said that progression is happening at a rate at which we are able to have actual show, we have actual face and pragmatic benefits. But second is to show that liberation wasn't a lie, we actually have something to show for it. So panel that is diverse as we are, we want you to know that we are the only side of the house who actually advocates for change. We're the only side of the house who understands that the role of media is to uplift minorities.
Boipelo just spent 8 minutes explaining to us why quotas within the rugby system were good for people like Siya Kolisi and Mpimpi. Name 4 other black rugby players, Boipelo. 60% of it is black. Why do we not see the 60% on the pitch? Tell us why. But more than that, he didn't even spend his speech explaining why these quota systems or the Rugby World Cup itself was a unifying front. Stick to the motion. We don't even think his speech was relevant in the first place. More strategic flaws because we think that a gap and a link is missing from their first to second speech. Why do we say so? Because we think in the first speech what they aimed to do was that they have some sort of marginal benefit for the people of South Africa. By the end of Boipelo's speech, what had we had? We had this idea that quotas are good in the rugby structure because they allow for black people to penetrate and enter into those rugby teams. We never got an idea as to why people existing as tokens in the rugby teams is good for the unifying front in South Africa. Why is it good for the person on the ground in Eastern Cape that Siya is in that team but is not being recognized to the fullest extent because he's always going to be seen as a token, as a Xhosa token more specifically? Why are we winning within today's debate on 2 clashes? Firstly, we'll speak about why it is an illegitimate portrayal, and then secondly we'll speak about what the portrayal actually does for people and why we think that's harmful. But before we even get into that, let's understand why we think like strategically they were always going to be off. The comparative was going to be, where are South Africans better? We don't think South Africans are going to necessarily be better on their side, even from their own matter. Because at no point in their first and second speech do they prove to us how people and individuals in South Africa are seeing the Rugby World Cup as a unifying front. If in Sandton all the white Afrikaners are celebrating that they've won the National World Cup, but within Alex, a few meters and kilometers away, people are not happy because they still see the structures that exist to prevent the entire team from succeeding with a large amount of black people. Why do you still do better on your side? We don't think we got any relevant analysis to that. But then first conversation that we need to have on legitimacy. As a side proposition, we told you it's not going to be legitimate because firstly, the narrative and the portrayal itself isn't true. Saying that you won the Rugby World Cup is unifying for all people of South Africa is specifically and just not true. Intuitively, we think as a room we're able to understand that that's just something that doesn't happen. Because people in the Rugby World Cup and the structures that exist within it are always going to be majority white. Why does that equal to the unifying of South Africa? We don't think people are going to feel that unifying on the ground. We told you why that's not going to happen. Because of the nature of that celebration and the nature of unity itself. We think unity should be more than just a burst of happiness, a burst of people and only one people feeling that unity. No, thank you. We think it should apply to each and every individual. Hence, we push the burden on them to prove why each and every individual within South Africa, or the majority of South Africa, is going to feel unified. We don't think that they're able to do that on their side. We don't think that their portrayal is legitimate then on those grounds. But more than that, they say that it's legitimate because of the way in which you're able to change that structure within rugby. The reason that the structures in rugby are changing is not because we're saying we want to be more unified. That's not the narrative that we're using to change rugby. The narrative that we're using to change rugby is the fact that black people are not being recognized. That sort of narrative is very, very different to this idea of the Rainbow Nation kind of sounding narrative that they want to push onto people. We don't think that that narrative is legitimate because it doesn't characterize the problem within those rugby structures. It actively excludes them. It says to people people or black people that you're unified because you have one person, you have Siya Kolisi, shut up, you should be happy. We don't think it takes into account the fact that people on the ground still cannot recognize Siya as isn't the only person that can be within rugby. We think rugby structures need to change with another narrative. Because what we think you did, and then we went on to explain to you why it's not legitimate, is because of the sort of effects that it has on the outside. Saying that white people are able to say, look, you got Siya, you should be happy, we won the World Cup, what are you complaining about? On the ground, we don't think people are unified because they still can't feel that change. If we tell you that even on their tour, they weren't able to go to Eastern Cape and rural areas that were originally in support of Siya himself, we tell you that that is not unifying. You still have some divides that exist within that structure. But moreover then, we spoke about tribalism and why it was particularly important seeing that the Rugby World Cup had a Xhosa captain. At the end of the day, we think what has happened there is that you've created more separation, more not unity. We think people then within South Africa have been feeling the divide. They haven't been able to be unified because Xhosa people are backing Siya. It is not the same as black people backing Siya because we think it's been taken to the extreme of only looking at Xhosa. We think it's very, very evident in the sort of support that Siya himself has. So people are able to be happy with the fact that Siya is captain, but we think it's been taken to the extent of actively dividing groups. We don't think you create unity there. But then drawing onto my POI of why I even asked this idea of supporting as a nation, why we wouldn't support the unifying front of Banyana Banyana as man and woman, why we wouldn't support that portrayal. It was to show to you that you cannot portray that men and women are here in South Africa are unified. Gender-based violence is still a thing. We think it's illegitimate for you to portray that because we all support Banyana Banyana, therefore we are all unified in South Africa. We think that portrayal is illegitimate because it doesn't reflect what is going on within society. That's where we find the problem. After I take this POI, I'll be proving why strategically it was important for them to create some sort of net benefit for overall people and why that portrayal doesn't do so. But Boyps, talk.
Do you think South Africans would be more unified without the Rainbow Nation narrative?
Right, we think, yes, we think what instead needed to exist was this sort of narrative, that a sort of narrative that was able to outline the harms of apartheid itself. So not saying that we all have to be happy dandy and be a rainbow nation, but actually acknowledge the problems that were going on within South Africa and actively have a narrative that didn't emphasize on being unified, but that emphasized on the problems within structures. But then moreover, this last clash of what the portrayal actually does. Panel, we think it's very regrettable that we get a side opposition that is not able to recognize what it means for black South Africans to have to be obligated to be happy with the fact that the white rugby team was able to win the World Cup. Just because I have a captain that is black within the World Cup does not mean I feel unified. It does not mean I am able to converse with the Afrikaner that is across me. It does not mean that we are unified as a South Africa. We think for the person on the ground that they needed to speak about, it is not doing any good for them. You are not able to progress the sort of people that you want to progress because you force them to say that this is a unified front. The portrayal is always going to be on media. It is always going to be pushed by white people behind that media. It is always going to have one perspective of we are unified. Even when we can see that the racial divides still exist within South Africa, we don't think that portrayal is legitimate for the black person on the ground. We are always able to do better for that person when we say you don't have to feel obligated to feel unified. You can exist within your own space and have other narratives in order to change the rugby structures you have to always propose.
Side Proposition's whole case was mainly based on very big lies. We think it's very funny how even in their own case, they outline their lies. When they tell you that black people didn't feel empowered at all because they couldn't identify with Siya Kolisi because he came from a private school. Then go on to say that Xhosa people were overwhelmingly proud and then they started having tribalism. That is so weird in the analysis because that clearly shows that people were actually empowered and still and people still recognize Siya Kolisi as an overwhelming structure for black empowerment. Under their own analysis, their lies are outlined even in their own case. We don't think side proposition can win mainly because of their blatant lies, but even more so, the way they mischaracterized what this portrayal looked like. In today's debate, we're going to evaluate it using their own criteria in today's debate. They told you that they're going to regret things under 3 criteria. Firstly, when it creates some form of regression for the country. Secondly, when it perpetuates a harmful narrative. Then lastly, when the portrayal itself was something that was not necessarily true. We're going to evaluate it on their own basis and show you why they still lose under their own criteria. Let's get into the first point, which is, does it create regression in today's debate? So side opposition comes here and tries to argue the fact that the biggest problem that they have in today's debate and that it creates regression because of some form of sexism that exists in society. So they tell you that they tell you under that situation we don't get enough coverage for sports such as netball because of that. We tell you this is just necessarily false. We don't think that the netball team didn't even win the World Cup. They won the African World Cup. That's a lie. But secondly, we tell you the reason we don't support it in most cases is because it's purely white dominated. There's just like 2 players in the Netball World Cup that are actually black. We think under that situation, we necessarily tell you that is why they don't get enough media coverage. That is why we tell you it's important to specify what the portrayal of the Rugby World Cup looked like. It looked like us putting black people in the forefront of the game. This is what made it necessarily more inherently media favored, but even more so, made it more impactful in the way that it existed. Under that criteria, we don't think it creates any form of regression. We don't think this was necessarily true. But even if it was true, we tell you this is not significant enough for us to just regret the whole portrayal just because it doesn't cover enough sport. This is not enough reason, especially if they keep telling us that this is more about the net effect that it had, unlike just like as individual basis, which is what their case actually was. We don't think this is something that is necessarily true. Even more so, we think it's very funny that side opposition wants to come here and run the fact that there has been no change whatsoever in the structural ways of rugby. So they tell us that there's not been any form of progression in the way that we view sports in general, but even more so in the way that we unite as South Africa. It's funny that they were in the same room that they sat with white people and celebrated the Rugby World Cup with their own white people in their own delegation. Funny that Ella says that people didn't want to sing the Afrikaner part of the Afrikaans part of the national anthem. We don't think that necessarily means that there was no form of unity at all. If she's able to concede that for a moment in that situation, it was a unifying force, we are able to tell you we win under that situation. There was no form of regression. They lose under their own criteria. Let's get into the second thing, which is the idea of how it perpetuates harmful narratives. The biggest narrative they told us in today's debate was this idea of tribalism. They tell us, well, people in Xhosa people just started glorifying themselves, and this is something that is necessarily harmful. Firstly, we think that was not the biggest conversation that actually happened. The biggest conversation that people actually had was about how he was actually black. Secondly, even if some form of tribalism actually existed in that society, we don't think it was one that was necessarily harmful. We don't think there was a problem with Xhosa people saying that they're very proud of him for being Xhosa in that society. We think it didn't create some form of entrenched, like, problematic system that side opposition wants to paint to you. We think even Zulu people were happy for Xhosa people. We think even Tonga people were happy for Xhosa people. As long as it was a black person, we think this was enough to satisfy South Africa. This was a uniting force. We're happy to agree with this. I've already shown to you how even that characterization wasn't necessarily true. The second thing they tell us under this situation is that they use black people as a form of tokenization. It's funny that they only want to celebrate black people when they come as a collective, but when they come as an individual, it's something that's necessarily problematic. They don't show us why it's problematic for us to celebrate this individual at a point at which they were able to unite the whole of South Africa. Even if it was just one individual, we still think in that situation, it's still something that we value in that criteria. We don't see any analysis as to why this tokenization was one that was necessarily harmful to the way we united as a nation. Because it's important to understand that this debate is more about how we united as a nation, not about how intrinsically we had some form of bad things happen. It's about the net force that we were able to impact in that society. The second thing that side opposition tries to tell us is that rugby structures have not actually changed. It's weird how they didn't listen to Boiphilo's his whole speech where he tells you it's most likely that black people feel empowered to then go into these structures because they realize that there could be more than just a quota system in that society. We tell you one, that actually changes bad narratives in society. We tell you under that criteria, we disprove your own criteria, but even more so, we tell you that it changes the way rugby actually existed. We think we have some form of progression. Even more so, they still ignore Boipilo's speech about how this actually created some form of good narrative success for South Africa on an international basis, showing to the rest of the world that there actually has been some form of progression and our liberation was something that was not necessarily false. We think that opposition doesn't do enough to characterize what this portrayal actually looked like. They can't win today's debate. Prove me wrong.
Understand, Nomsa, why are all your benefits of black people feeling empowered by Sia being in the rugby team exclusive to Unity?
They're not exclusive at all. We think this is something that still happened regardless. Like, this is something that we still prioritize. There is some form of unity. This is something that we vie for. So let's quickly sum up this point on whether or not it perpetuates any harmful narrative. Firstly, we've already proven to you that the harmful narratives were something that was not necessarily even true. But even if they were true, we were able to get some form of net benefit from it. Secondly, we've also proven to you how we change the way that rugby exists on a structural basis. But even more so, we've shown to you that we better minority groups in our debate. We think we're way more better for harmful narratives. We change them in today's debate. Let's get into the last criteria that they had in today's debate, which was this portrayal something that was necessarily true? The biggest problem that they have in today's debate under that criteria is the fact that it didn't reach enough people. Firstly, we tell you that it's just false. Sia Kolisi went back into his community and actively interacted with the people from his community. We think this is enough to prove to you that what they're saying is just a blatant lie. But at the point at which, even if it didn't reach enough people in that society, we think these are minor. We think this is less of a society. This is less of a community than the people that they were actually able to reach. We think even under that situation, even if they went to Joburg, Pretoria, the people in Joburg and Pretoria are still enough to say that we were able to unify them. They are still valuable actors in the unity that was formed in that society, especially if they are the ones who usually control these narratives in the community. Lastly, we think it's important for us to then look at side opposition's characterization of how this actually played out. It's funny how they want to say that very few black people were impacted by this. This is a lie. We look at social media. We look at the way people interacted after that. But even more so, we're happy to tell you that even if it didn't reach a very few minority groups, even if it didn't reach a very few individuals in society, it was able to reach the people in which it impacted the most. We think this is the black people in society. We think this is what we do as a side opposition. If you stand for a side that understands diversity and how this portrayal actually looked like, you stand for opposition.
Adjudicators, we think that proposition has seemed to miss the majority of the debate. Their third was literally just saying their matter again and never really engaging. We think what was actually missed in this debate was two key things from the proposition. First of all, was the portrayal something that was ever legitimate? Note the bulk of our analysis under this was speaking about the role of media within South Africa and their ability to shift narratives and empower minorities. Their only response to this was, there are still problems in South Africa, therefore we can't paint the picture that South Africa is perfect. That feeds into the second question about what the portrayal actually looked like. Because note the bulk of their case never actually speaks about what this portrayal was. They speak about the portrayal being one of South Africa being a united country. This was a debate about portraying the Rugby World Cup win as something that can lead us to be unified. It's a unifying force that is making things better, not one that has fixed everything and made it all better. Panel, that was where this debate happened, and we think on those grounds, proposition never came to stand with us. Two clashes in this debate. First of all, who is better for unity in South Africa? And second of all, was the portrayal something that was legitimate? First of all, on the idea of better as a unifying force. They wanted to use weird buzzwords like you need a net benefit and you need to benefit everyone in society as a whole on a net scale. I don't have a formula for working that out, but for what I could get in best was, first of all, if we want to do it in debating terms, on a comparative, we have done more for getting more black people and more white people talking to each other. In their worst case scenario, we get a white Afrikaans man talking to a white English man. Obviously, we don't care about those actors, but note we we still get some sort of unity. But that wasn't even the realistic outcomes of the way that this worked. We told you on our side of the house what unity actually looked like was black people feeling more united in terms of entering black spaces. That's why they miss the bulk of my speech. Because I didn't say in my conclusion, this is about unity, they said my speech was not about unity. We told you how empowering black people to enter white spaces is something that is inherently important. There were 2 points under that they never replied to. First of all, they never interacted with the idea of breaking down white structures and allowing black people to enter. That is unifying for black people and the country as a whole. Second of all, we told you, even if you never fix that at our point, at least you have more black children looking up to black individuals. They wanted to make this debate about the rest of society, but ignore the black actor who is the most marginalized. Second of all, was the portrayal something that was legitimate? So underneath this, all we really get from the proposition was saying that the portrayal is illegitimate because that is not the true representation of what South Africa is. So let's understand from the beginning of our O1 how we characterize this debate and why they missed our context. We said this was a portrayal about saying we can change the way South Africa is and moving forward, not a portrayal of us being a perfect nation. The reason we take this point is for 2 main reasons. First of all, we told you the role of media here is allowed to act devoid of outcomes of proving that we actually unify people. They are allowed to use Siya Kolisi as a token, if they want to say that, and make him a standpoint of black excellence and allow for people to strive to be that. Tokenism on their side of the house is something that is harmful because it is one person. One is better than nothing on your side of the house. We win on the comparative. Second of all, the reason the portrayal was legitimate is because we try to prove to you on a principle level that we are better for people who have never had access to the type of things that they speak about. We speak about the 1995 World Cup, where the portrayal of the media was able to show that we are better from where we were from apartheid. That the idea of civil war to the rest of the world was something that was a reality. So even if they thought that civil war was still a reality after apartheid, the portrayal of the World Cup being a unifying force of our nation on a comparative makes us better. We think that was already better. I proved that in my international perceptions point. No response to that. So panel, when adjudicating, what should you take into consideration? 3 things. First of all, if their end goal was to prove how we get better net benefit, we did that better on a comparative. Second of all, this debate about proving the legitimacy of a portrayal of a unifying force was done on our side. We always win.
Can I start? Perhaps a team that lauds itself for its diversity and in fact makes it the hinge point of their case shouldn't homogenize all black South Africans. Shouldn't say that when Siya Kolisi became captain, all black South Africans were rejoicing, that all Xhosa people weren't being tribalistic, and that all Zulu people were happy for their fellow black men. Because frankly, that's the Rainbow Nation narrative that got people disillusioned with this. That's the Rainbow Nation narrative that has further divided us, and that's the Rainbow Nation narrative that fuels this when people realize that this hasn't caused much more unity, this hasn't caused much more strength, and I am still stuck in a township and I still don't know the rules of rugby because this was never given to me as an accessible point. With that, 3 clashes in today's debate. First of all, is this true in the first place? Second of all, even if it isn't true, is the net effect positive? Note, their net effect is hinged on it being true in the first place, given their side in the debate. And finally, is the emphasis and the extent of the emphasis in and of itself moral? Before that, let's do some strategic clear up. So, first of all, on the idea of truth, the only idea that they gave us was that they didn't give us any idea why it was going to be unifying between individual people. They said it was a unifying front when Siya shook hands with Prince William, and that was very, very good. Their analysis about how it's going to change interactions between a black person and a white person came in Boipelo's reply. We don't think that's enough, but we also don't think they did sufficient analysis in the reply alone. 2, they only said that this truth came from people having pride. We've shown you that having pride doesn't mean unifying. ANC people have pride when you win the election. It doesn't change the fact that Ace Magashule wants Cyril Ramaphosa to be dead. You can like your own individual win. That pride doesn't necessarily mean unity. 2, they said that they needed to prove some positive outcome. Note, panel, this means that they think that they can win this debate if they created anything positive. They made one more black rugby fan, they've won this debate. No, this debate was about the comparative, making it comparatively better for people on the ground. So, I'm going to prove why we have. Onto the first flash of truth. Why did they say that it's true that this was unifying? Once again, keeping in mind the strategic flaw of the interactions. One, they say that there was a majority black team. From our intro, we said that this lovely mixed-race team had racism in it. Etzebeth himself was tried for hate speech. That's not unity, that's affront. That's not changing the way rugby players interact with themselves. Beast left SA Rugby because he felt that this was something that was infringing on his rights as a black man because they weren't changing any of the structures. Two, they said that there was pride about Siya Kolisi and a majority of this was black pride. One, tribalism lessened that pride, it lessened the net effect, it lessened the truth of this. Two, people see Siya Kolisi as a sellout for marrying a white woman, for not marrying into his own kind. Three, Siya Kolisi didn't visit a lot of rural villages in order to do this type of stuff. More people see him as a sellout, more people dislike Siya Kolisi. Four, a lot of people see Siya Kolisi as a token black. Less people like Siya Kolisi. That's lessening your net effect as we speak. Next, they said that the history of rugby is impactful. We agree. We've told you it has a history of racism, a history of exclusion, that we're a new South Africa, that the nation, Rainbow Nation narrative didn't work in. We can't perpetuate the same thing without changing much. Just because we have a slightly more mixed race team, it doesn't mean you've changed the way that people interact with each other. People are unified. What did we tell you? We told you about racism in South African rugby. We told you that you didn't acknowledge the harm to Siya in order to get there in the first place in this narrative. You told you that you didn't reach rural South Africa, the people we need to unify with the most. We don't think we need to unify with black corporate people in Sandton. We need to unify with people in rural KwaZulu-Natal because they don't have access to this like the people in the Eastern Cape. We told you about tribalism, how that's going to lessen the unity, and we told you how the black youth feel disenfranchised and feel that this isn't something that they can relate to, especially people who support the EFF who's been vehemently against this. Finally, on the net effect, even if this is true, what did we tell you? One, we push for better quotas, we push for more quotas. Beast and Siya both made it to these teams despite the quotas in the first place. They wouldn't have been involved in the quota system in the first place if they hadn't had access to private schools. That the liberation narrative is good, but it wasn't good enough. We don't want people to be complacent, we want change.